Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Community Alliance for Better Government. Our webinar tonight is on achieving equitable housing development in Evanston. And we're just really excited, not only that you're all here, but we have some terrific speakers who represent, it's just 4 of them, but they represent the city, a nonprofit activist group, and 2 policy and funding entities in Chicago who have a lot that they can share with us, a lot of expertise, and really all of us are experts too. So what we're hoping is that by the end of this, everybody will be all engaged and ready to do the work to bring about an equitable housing market and housing, not just market, but housing platform in Evanston. So just very quickly, I'll tell you who CABG is. So for those of you who don't know, Community Alliance for Better Government started at the end of 2019. We started in the wake of the termination of a leader in city government that named Kevin Brown that a lot of us were upset about, and we felt as a result that maybe people weren't being heard, that there was a disconnect, and he's African American. So we felt like, okay, what's going on here? It seems like the people on one end of the podium in the city civic center is in one space and people in another. So we formed CABG. Bennett Johnson, Oliver Ruff, and Rick Marsh were the original founders. And we've basically morphed into just really an organization that tries to bring the people to the city and the city to the people. It's as simple as that, and really focused on racial equity, government transparency, and full civic engagement. So tonight, as we're talking about housing, just to set the stage before we hear from our 4 speakers. So the challenge in Evanston is we have a built out community. It's not like McHenry County where, we can, there's lots of land to build out into. And so patterns that were put in place over a century ago, much more than that, related to how neighborhoods are, where people of different races can live. Those were put in place many, many years ago. So as we're looking at undoing that, how do we do it? At the same time, there is great demand in Evanston. This is a community that everybody, every sort of demographic would like to live in. So how do we handle all populations, including college students, all income levels? We're a job-rich community. We're transit-rich. Since the 1990s, especially, we've seen a proliferation of development downtown. Evanston has a downtown skyline. That's why I picked the photo that's behind me here. So we have a lot of smaller, wealthier households living in downtown Evanston. People now talk about the missing middle. We talk about people experiencing homelessness. We talk about essential workers. These are all people who are also trying to get a toehold in Evanston. So now I move into what's happening. So there's the zeitgeist has changed. I think we can say that there's a lot more interest in racial equity and affordable housing than, and I've been in this field for almost 40 years, than I've seen in my tenure. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers. So first will be Sarah Flax, who's the Community Development Director in Evanston and has been working for Evanston for many, many years. And after she talks about what is the development process or what isn't the development process or what do we hope it'll be, We will then hear from Sue Loellbach with Connections for the Homeless. She runs their Joining Forces for Affordable Housing project, and they've been working on an equitable zoning initiative that sounds fascinating, and we'll hear more about it. Then we'll hear from Roberto Requejo, who is the head of Elevated Chicago, and I've known him in wearing several hats. I think he was with the Chicago Community Trust, right? And maybe the federal, the Fed. Trying to remember the different places, and but gangbusters everywhere. And Traci Sanders with Enterprise Community Partners, which has done amazing work, and she's done amazing work in different municipalities around the country and community planning and funding around housing. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gail. I have been working at this city for coming up on 17 years, but the bulk of that has been in managing our federal entitlement grants and working toward developing more affordable housing, preserving the affordable housing we have, very much enmeshed in the housing world. One of the things that I want to talk about, Gail said, can you talk about the development process? And I said, well, I'd rather talk about what the development process needs to become, because our development process isn't super friendly or easy to navigate right now. So I'm going to, if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen and just take you through some pretty simple slides that were used. Let's see. Okay, so are you now seeing slides? Okay, great. Evanston has a lot of ideas of what we want to be and how we need to change, but we don't have a very good structure for making those changes. And that's why I'm saying we're planning for Evanston's future. We are going to build a more modern, flexible, and equitable, progressive approach to development and to our community. We have just, we're in the process of seeking a consultant for a new comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is really what drives the development or what guides the development of a community in many, many aspects. Housing is one of them, and a very important one, and a very unrepresented one in our current comprehensive plan. So really we need, this will involve really inclusive and robust community engagement, collaboration with all kinds of different public and private groups and neighborhood groups, everybody. We're really, as we were talking about, trying to reach many, many people, especially the people who don't normally have their voices heard. A lot of data collection, mapping all of that good stuff. And really, the goal is to incorporate community-led grassroots ideas on what our community should be and what we want it to be. That has really been not done so much in the past, because much of the planning of this sort of stuff was done with a pretty selective group of people who were experts in that field. Well, what is a comprehensive plan? Real quickly, it establishes what a community strives to achieve for its built environment and the human interaction within that environment. And I think that's a big change from older comprehensive plans or more traditional, because it was the built environment and there wasn't a whole lot about thinking of the people living in it and how it impacted them. Covers land use, transportation, housing, economic development, sustainability, not something that really was in our existing plan, historic preservation, city and community facilities and institutions, and much, much more can even be included and be identified throughout the community outreach in the planning process. It's to provide predictability for the anticipated or planned future of a community, and incorporates and links to city goals and policies in one guiding document. Okay, so what are we dealing with right now, and why do we need to make this change? Our comprehensive plan is from 2000. And it was just a tweak to an older plan then, and it doesn't contemplate things like global and regional changes, some of the technology changes. There's nothing about climate action change or climate change and actions we need to mitigate that. It doesn't address numerous community issues, including aging in place, polarization of wealth. In Evanston, our decline in our minority populations, at least in our African-American population. We may have growth in others, but we are losing part of what has historically made Evanston. And it doesn't incorporate or really even address many of the things that are in other city plans and policies that have been issued and done since that plan. And sometimes it's even in conflict with them. So we have a mess, right? And when you have a comprehensive plan, you have something underneath that plan, which is that guides the actual work and says what you can do where. And that is your zoning. And we will hear more from Sue later on what kind of responses we're hearing to some of our zoning. But I can tell you that it is completely out of date. The last major update to the zoning code was done in 1993. We've amended it any number of times, which has addressed individual things, but it is also complicated, almost impossible for anyone to understand, and divided up into so many different zoning districts and what you can and can't do, that it is almost impossible to develop things in a modern and a comprehensive way, because the zoning underlying it is still too unfriendly to any kind of many kinds of new kinds of development. Evanston is only about 7.5 to 8 square miles, but we have 34 different zoning districts. Some of the, in addition, overlay districts, which provides different zoning requirements in 6 districts. 2 are actually form-based, code-based, which is a way of looking. You look at the size and scale of buildings and less how they're used, but it's external, how the buildings fit into the environment. And all of this complications, this complicated system means that almost anytime anybody tries to do anything, especially anything that's new and different, like larger developments for affordable housing, our code triggers really a need for excessive zoning relief and a very, very complicated process of going through to get approvals of almost anything. So what does that really look like? So this map here is a simplified version of our zoning, and it needs to be simplified and streamlined in many ways. Oftentimes when we talk about housing and the inability to build affordable housing, one of the things you hear is a lot of our land is zoned for single family development only. And I know this is really hard to see because it's small, but the lightest kind of barely pale yellow area is single family zoning, and so is much of this slightly darker yellow area. So that means when you want to do something like say, wow, townhomes are great, and you can get townhomes that give people the ability to have, you can own a townhome fee simple. You don't have to necessarily have a a homeowner association or anything like that. You can get more of them into an area, the same area that you might put a single family home. Well, you could if the zoning would allow it, but right now the zoning doesn't allow it in most areas. So housing types that were invented centuries ago, in some cases, to provide relatively dense housing and relatively compact communities, because communities had to be, because people didn't have cars, they had to walk, they had to, they had to get around that way. The types of housing that initiated in those sorts of environments, we've pretty much zoned out of existence. We became the other interesting thing is, when you think about Evanston, one of the things I hear from people is, oh, I love Evanston. You have so many different neighborhoods. You've got neighborhoods that have apartment buildings next to single family homes, next to, 3 flats and things like that. And it's not ticky-tacky. Everything isn't all the same. And then our zoning, which is largely still Euclidean zoning, which is, you do this here, the setback has to be this, everything has to be. We've imposed that over a community that people said is what makes us special and gives us charm. That was more flexible and incorporated different kinds of housing types and different uses in different areas. So we kind of need to look back at our roots, I think. Some of the stuff that was done back when Evanston was first developing is stuff we should look at and be looking at reintroducing and allowing again. We have a lot of exclusionary practices that result in systemic inequities, and R1 zoning exclusively in a large area is one of those. R1 zoning is exclusionary in many ways because it doesn't allow you to do anything but build a single house on a lot, and it specifies the lot size. Well, that means that is going to drive up the cost of housing or anything in that, because you can't make more efficient use of land. You can't house more people there. And one of the funny things is, in some of our neighborhoods, when they were built up as single family neighborhoods, and still are, the houses had more people in them because we had larger households. And so now we've even de-densified some of our neighborhoods just by the nature of our households. And they are increasingly wealthy because those areas, and you can't have an economic mix in them due to the requirements of what you can and can't build. So we have to look at focusing on bulk and placement of structures more than the density. There are some really creative things you see in other communities where you can look at something and it looks like a big house, but it might have 3 different units in it in some way. They're condos, they could be condo, they could be rental, but it still has the scale of the building has the scale of the neighborhood that it is in. So there are lots of ways you can increase the number of people who can live, the number of households, most of them smaller, but you can also make it more affordable because you're making better, more effective use of the land, which reduces the cost. So lots of things like that. We need to reduce the regulations that trigger zoning relief for everything and make more things that can be developed by right. And we really need to replace outdated regulations with best practices, many of which are going to come out of this. That's like introducing different housing types again. Gail mentioned the missing middle. If you look at Evanston's, our population, we kind of have a reverse curve. We've lost much of our middle income housing, much of our middle income population because they can't afford the housing or find the housing types that they want. So we need to look at making it possible to build new and different types of housing and other things, and create walkable neighborhoods so that we also get rid of some of the, we're considered walkable compared to many communities, but we can get better at it and make it increase use of public transportation, reduce use of single vehicles to get around and address climate action, affordability, and availability all at one time. You know, get more people out of cars and using public transportation. You don't spend as much land on parking and you don't require as much parking. Those are the types of things that the city is working to do to make it possible to become a more equitable, affordable, and welcoming community, again, for people at all levels of the economic strata and all types of backgrounds. So I think that's one of the things, by the way, in the comprehensive planning process that we will be including in our review and have required that in the RFP is the work that Sue has been doing on looking at zoning and identifying the inequitable aspects of that zoning and calling them out so that we really all are aware of how our zoning affects what can be done where, which is really important to change. All right, so I'm going to stop and I'm going to let Sue take over.
Thank you for that, Sarah. You really set the stage, and I find it interesting that you said that Evanston used to be more flexible than it became. So that's really, really interesting to know. Thank you. Yeah. So Sue, you have the baton.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm Sue Loellbach. I work at Connections for the Homeless, and we have a program called Joining Forces for Affordable Housing, which is our advocacy program that's focused on advocacy for more affordable housing. And the reason we have that, Connections is primarily a direct service agency. We provide a lot of services to people who are struggling with housing. And our mission is to serve and catalyze the community to end homelessness one person at a time, which we cannot do if there isn't more affordable housing available. So that's why we formed Joining Forces. And we have quite a few Joining Forces members on the call today. So that is awesome. Thank you for being here. I think for many of you, what we're talking about, our equitable zoning project, isn't going to be news, but I think it'll be interesting for you to hear about it in the context of this broader discussion. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I have quite a few slides. I'm going to go through them very quickly, and we can focus, more discussion wherever you want to. So I can't multitask, so I'm going to be quiet for a minute while I share this. I have lost the multitasking ability as I get older. So, okay. So, quite a few years ago, Joining Forces was starting to recognize that as Evanston was getting closer to actually building affordable housing, we started seeing a trend that zoning was really being used as a way to sort of kill both affordable projects as well as other kinds of development. It's very, very hard to develop something in Evanston. And, both for good reasons, probably, as well as for some of the things that Sarah was talking about. So we decided to do our own analysis of the code. And so us not being zoning experts, we went through and read all of it, and we did think we saw some issues. Seemed like there were some requirements that could really, really drive up costs. Seemed like there were some things that were really sort of preserving the stratification in the community about where people could live, basically reinforcing some of the redlining that was put in place years and years ago. So it's not that neighborhoods were still redlined, but there were differences in the zoning code for different neighborhoods that made it improbable that through housing we would be able to address the issue of segregation. And then also saw restrictions that in the same vein were really increasing socioeconomic and racial inequity. So we suspected that. We actually drafted a list of potential recommendations, but also knew that we weren't the experts. And so, thought maybe, well, let's see if there are some experts who would like to work with us. So we decided to develop this equitable zoning project. So it's morphed into having several phases. Okay, the first one was that we found this company in Cincinnati called ZoneCo. It's a zoning consultancy that was in the process of developing its own equitable zoning methodology. And they agreed to work with us. We helped pay some of their expenses. I think we paid them like $5,000 total. And so they have, they used that to, covers, some of their expenses. They actually spent a ton of time on this, did way more than that. But anyways, they went through like 800 lines in Evanston zoning code. And they also identified some potentially problematic areas in the code. And you're going to see repetition here from what you saw in Sarah's list of what she would be interested in seeing new zoning actually doing. So ZoneCo identified a lot of focus in our zoning code on decreasing congestion and maintaining neighborhood character. Character is used a lot throughout the zoning code without actually being defined. No focus on equity, which we weren't surprised about. I don't think most zoning codes have a focus on equity, but we felt if there was an impact on equity, perhaps that should be changed. A lot of inefficient land use with requirements that boost costs of housing. A lot of restrictions, including some restrictive use of the word family and using that to sort of dictate who can live with whom, which feels less like a land use issue than perhaps more of a behavioral or nuisance or even occupancy, a housing kind of thing, not so much zoning. And then also a lot of lack of flexibility in development rules. So, in terms of, what constitutes a variation? Well, almost anything constitutes a variation. So, just a lot of difficulties that way. So ZoneCo put together a report for us. And again, knowing that this is Evanston, and also knowing that this was a review of the words on the page, not of what the actual impact is in the community, we felt it was really important to get community input. We wanted to learn whether the zoning code actually was not only preserving property values and doing some of the things that it's supposed to do, but is it sort of doing the opposite for some people? Is it harming some people in some ways? So we did invite the community at large to participate in this project. We have connections, has lots of contacts with homeowners and the people who are probably most prosperous, a lot of white people, a lot of the sort of leaders in the community, and a lot of the people who already speak up about zoning. So we invited them to participate. But we really wanted to balance that out. We wanted to reach the people that would be most likely to struggle with housing. And so we had, we reached out to our client base, to people who have received, homelessness prevention funding, all different kinds of things. We reached out, but also knowing that there are so many people in Evanston that are struggling with housing that are not needing homeless services. They're not coming to us for help. So we really looked at, okay, who is most likely to be impacted by the lack of affordable housing? That really was households with incomes under $50,000 a year, people of color, and people with disabilities. And so that's who we decided to focus on with this project in terms of our really active outreach. And knowing that there wasn't a lot of incentive for people in the community who are already struggling with housing to come out and talk to us about zoning, we decided that it would be a good idea to engage with some trusted messengers, some people who actually have the real relationships throughout the community who could share information about the importance of this, the impact of zoning on people's lives, and the importance of getting people's voices. So I'm not going to read this list, But after going through an RFP process, we engaged with this group of organizations to help us do outreach into the community. And so these Center for Independent Futures works primarily with people with disabilities, and they reached out to some other organizations that do the same. Several of these organizations are really embedded in various parts of the Black community. I would say the Black communities in Evanston. Evanston Latinos is very involved with a large part of the Latino communities. And then we have a couple consulting firms, and these are very well-connected members of the Black communities that actually do work with, the Black sororities, the communities of faith, lots of different groups, the realtists, the folks working on reparations and so on. So we did a pretty good job, I think, of reaching out to these folks and engaging them to work with us. This phase 2 is the one that we have just wrapped up. So this is where I have the most detail for you. As we were working through the process of gathering feedback, we got support from the City of Evanston, from the Chicago Metropolitan Agency on Planning, and from ZoneCo, actually. We also got funding from several foundations. We used that to cover some of our expenses at joining forces, and also as compensation for the community groups, because we were asking them to put quite a bit of time and effort in this. And we wanted to make sure that they had the capacity to spend the time on this project that was needed, whether this was compensating, somebody to actually do the work, whether it was using the funding to compensate the people to fill out surveys or focus groups. We let them decide what would be the most effective way to use the money. And then we worked with these community groups to design a survey and a focus group. And we ended up administering a little bit over 400 surveys. And we hosted a bunch of focus groups with about 110 people. Okay. This was over a period of probably 6 months. And I feel like we fought for every one of these numbers. And so did the community groups. This was, you ask people to fill out a survey on zoning that people don't get automatically super excited about this. So this was, I would say we met our goals, but I'm not sure we exceeded them. This is a difficult process. We asked questions on demographics, experiences with housing. We talked about some of the related issues like transportation, parking, employment, definitely asked about accessibility, walkability, and so on. And we did ask and talk about zoning issues. And so these were some of the things we asked people to consider. What's most important to you? What would be most important if a building were being built on your street next to your house? What would you really care about? What would you want there? What would you not want there? And so these are some of the kinds of things we were asking about. And I don't have all of the results for you. I'm not going to share a lot of results tonight. We're in the process of, we just cleaned all of the data, and what we wanted, we're going to be providing a report that really talks about whether people of different demographics answered our questions differently. One thing I can tell you though, based on the focus groups, I don't think Evanston is ready for parking reform. Man, people got really emotional about parking. So I think that's going to be a tough one. So Paul Zalmazak, I know he wants to do some parking reform. That's going to be a heavy lift, I think. But there were a few people had just interesting ideas about all of this stuff. And so I haven't seen where it's going to come out yet. So I'm really eager to see that. Here's a couple of things we covered in the focus groups. One of the things we were talking about is the zoning regulations we feel should really support the community's commitment to the well-being, the prosperity, and the equity of all residents. And our big question is, are all residents really feeling the benefit from the zoning in all of these areas? And so one of the things, we had a great tool to work with, which was the city's E-plan. And so, we took the old redlining map, which is the one here on the left that shows, the 5th Ward very clearly redlined. And then the E-plan was just full of maps that showed this exact same pattern, with the absolute worst things in the city happening in that same area. And this is so geographically based that it's really hard to say, okay, what is going on with the zoning? Is there still a line of some kind around this? And so this map on the right is from the E-plan. It shows where the greatest concentrations of housing cost burden are in the city. And so basically you can see in this 5th Ward area, that's where the greatest housing cost burden is. It is also where the lowest incomes are, the shortest life expectancy, the greatest dearth of grocery stores, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So that's one of the things that made us think, okay, there's got to be some link here between how we're using our land and how people are doing.
Yeah, Sue, I
Yeah.
just want to make sure to get us to Roberto.
Okay, thank you. I will wrap it up. Thank you. So we did some other stuff. What we're doing next, we're doing a first pass of our data, cleaning it up. We're going to look at, where are the interesting pieces that we really need to dig into. Then we're going to develop our reports. One is going to be on the actual results of what we heard from the community, but the other one's going to be on our community outreach and input. So that we can share what worked well, what didn't. And then we're going to be rolling this out. And as Sarah mentioned, this will be input into the comprehensive planning process and zoning review. And we're going to share it with our contributors in the community at large. And we hope to start doing some of this work in other communities. So that's it. You asked me to wrap it up, Gail. I can do it.
Wow, great, thank you. This is all
There you go.
terrific stuff. And by the way, after our speakers speak, we're going to have our goal is that if not half, a good third of this meeting will be conversation and your questions. And I will pass it on to Roberto now.
Thank you, Gail. And thanks everybody for being here today and listening to people talk about zoning at 7:40 p.m. on a weeknight. You all deserve a medal here. So I'm gonna try to keep it as quick and interesting as possible. And as Gail was mentioning, it's important that you'll send us some questions. I don't know if people have access to the chat or not, but if you wanna start sending questions, ideas, or comments, feel free to do that during my presentation. So my name is Roberto Requejo. I'm the Executive Director of Elevated Chicago. We are a coalition of community-based organizations and institutions advancing equitable transit-oriented development in the city of Chicago. And I'm going to start sharing a few slides here. And we've been doing this since 2017. We have invested about $10 million in bricks and mortar projects near transit, from affordable housing to grocery stores to community centers, health clinics, whatever the community told us they wanted to see near transit. We have also spent a lot of time and energy in systems change and advocacy and zoning reform and parking reform, which is possible. And it's possible in Chicago, it's possible in Evanston. And also we spend a lot of time in storytelling and in narrative change in support of ETOD. I wanted to show you just quickly, this is our steering committee. Traci Sanders, who will speak after me, is one of our wonderful steering committee members. And it's a great mix and diverse mix of community-based, neighborhood-based organizations or organizers, community developers, affordable housing developers, and then citywide and region-wide organizations like the Chicago Community Trust, which acts as our home office. That's where we go when we are working from the office. And then Chicago Department of Public Health has been an amazing partner of Elevated Chicago from the beginning. CNT and MPC, which are two policy organizations region-wide, and of course, Enterprise and IFF, two community development financial institutions. The reason we came together is because we believe in the power of collaboration, and we do not want zoning and urban planning to be monopolized by just a few experts and technical folks. So I have to say I'm an urban planner myself. The best professional development and growth I've had in my life is when I have sat at the table with artists, public health professionals, community organizers, and also we are intentionally led by people of color and women. And so it's a type of group talking and advancing planning that is not the usual group that shows up when we're talking about development and housing. And it's been very effective in order to get to solutions. So what is ETOD? So as I mentioned before, our definition of equitable transit-oriented development is not coming from zoning experts, it's not coming from city planners, it's not coming from urban designers. It is the result of 6+ years of conversations with community residents and a very broad array of stakeholders across Chicago. And what we learned is that people love the place they live in when that neighborhood connects them to what they need. And that's the most important part here. This is about connection. This is about people being connected to what they really love and the people they love and the things they love. And so ETOD for us, or equitable transit-oriented development, is about planning with communities and not for communities. And planners are really good at planning for other people, and then other people don't like what we do. And so we need to stop that dynamic. And I see Sarah is laughing because she knows what I'm talking about. So for us, this is development near transit that is not for just for a few people. It's for people of all races, of people of all incomes, of people of all genders, sexual orientations, abilities. All of them should be able to experience the benefits of living near transit hubs in mixed use, pedestrian friendly, and compact neighborhoods. And for us, ETOD is also a tool that, if you think about it, when you build near transit, you are kind of attacking at the same time the 4 main crises that our region has gone through in the past few years. We have a clear racial equity crisis. We had a public health crisis at the same time. We had an economic crisis going on, and then climate change is there too. And when all of these things come together, usually the people that suffer the most, the consequences, are people of color, low-income people. And so ETOD, when you look at the research, the data shows all of these data points that you see here. Some of them are more evident than others. So of course, living near transit is cheaper. You can use transit instead of your car. You can save up to 23%, almost a quarter of your budget for housing and transportation if you live in an ETOD development. And then one thing just to keep in mind is that 60% of people who ride transit in the US are people of color, and that the ownership of cars is 3 times less for Black households than for white households. So for white households, 6% of them do not own a car. It's 18% of Black households that do not own a car. So you would think that if you build transit-oriented development, if you're building near transit, you are building for people of color, right? And that is not the case. And that's the difference between transit-oriented development and equitable transit-oriented development. So let me show you this map here, which is a map that we use a lot in Elevated Chicago. So Chicago arrived a little late to the world of transit-oriented development. The first ordinance incentivizing development near transit dates back to 2013, so it's only 10 years old. And the ordinance provided incentives to developers to build near transit. And the 2 main incentives that developers got was, 1, they were allowed to build more and bigger near transit, so they could sell more. And 2, they were allowed to reduce parking. And parking is very expensive to build. You can believe that is almost $30,000 per parking space. So imagine how much cheaper developers can build when you remove that, and how those cost savings can be passed on to residents. So anyway, these incentives were put in place in 2013. We looked at the map 5 years later, and this is what happened here. In this map, and I think all of you are familiar with Chicago, the vast majority of transit-oriented development happened in the north side, in the northwest side of Chicago, around the loop, the West Loop, which, as you all know, is booming, Pilsen, and the South Loop. And it was all concentrated there. In those communities, a TOD, or transit-oriented development, led to displacement through gentrification. So a lot of these buildings that were built, towers, in many cases, beautiful towers, wonderful to look at, but extremely unaffordable and very inappropriate for the communities that we have in Chicago and live in those neighborhoods. So a lot of those communities like Logan Square, you're familiar with that neighborhood, majority Latino community, they saw 20,000 residents leave in 10 years just because they were not able to afford this, the rents, the cost of the housing, property taxes. And then think about also small businesses that are renting space in these communities and they can no longer afford to work from that location, or think about nonprofit organizations that also renting in those communities and have to depart because suddenly prices are going up. And then, as I mentioned, also very inappropriate because a lot of these units are studios, one bedrooms, but the families that live in those communities often are extended families and they need 2, 3, 4 bedroom units. So that's one type of displacement. The other type of displacement, and I think we talked about this earlier before in this conversation, is what happened in the rest of Chicago, because as you can see, our west and south sides, which are majority African-American communities, saw very little. So 90% of the development happened in those concentrated areas, and the rest, the other 10%, was the west and the south sides. And in those areas, if you take the train, you'll see there is wonderful transit stops with frequent service, many of them new or renovated, surrounded by vacant land and surrounded by vacant buildings. And displacement in those communities looks like depopulation. So in those communities, people are not living because of the cost of housing necessarily. They're living because we have failed to provide it with the basic needs and the basic amenities that any citizen of any global city should have, like a grocery store or a health clinic, or proper housing, right? So anyway, we came together and we said, okay, we need to change all this. We assembled our collaborative. We brought to the table a number of funders, and we knew that this had to be about more than building bricks and mortar. It had to be about more than working on policy change. And it had to be a lot more than just organizing people. It had to be all of that together. So our work plan, if you look at it, it has a people, a place, and a process bucket. And all of those work together at the same time in order to change the way we build in Chicago near transit. Now, we talked about zoning tonight. And so when we embarked on changing zoning in Chicago, because part of the problem is that we are still very car oriented and we needed to change the zoning, we knew that there were 4 main obstacles that we had to tackle. And those 4 obstacles are, number one, political will. We had to find at least 26 of the 50 aldermen and women to vote yes on zoning reform in Chicago. And by the way, our zoning code had not been touched since 2004. And we were coming to the table with a pretty comprehensive set of changes, like 40, 50 pages of changes, radically reimagining what can and cannot be developed near public transit. So that was one of the obstacles. Second, this is a very obscure topic. This is not something people like to talk about necessarily. Sue mentioned, her journey trying to get people to show up and talk about zoning. And we had to kind of work on how we're talking about zoning, and how we should stop talking about zoning. Third, we have an inertia problem. The system is built for cars. Everything you look around, everything is a lot easier if you add more parking and more cars to it. And everything that is about making it more pedestrian friendly, more accessible for people in wheelchairs, more available for bikers is harder. You need permits, you need process. So that was working also against us. And finally, there is NIMBYism. So a lot of folks saying, I don't want that in my backyard. I don't want more density. I don't want more traffic. I don't want less parking. I don't want Black people. I don't want Latino people. So all of that pushback was also really heavy in Chicago. And just like you all in Evanston, we have both types of NIMBYs. We have the ones that clearly show up and tell you, I don't want those people here. I don't want people who don't speak English. I don't want people of that race. But we have also on the front, I have the everybody's welcome sign. But behind closed doors, I don't want 2 flat next to my single family home. And I'll be pressuring my alderman behind the scenes because I want to protect my property values and my entitlement and my privilege, usually in white and wealthy communities. So this is one thing just to keep in mind as you go on in your journeys as residents. Do not believe those signs on the front yard that say, we welcome everybody here. Some of them are true, many of them are not. So what did we do? So tackle these 4 key obstacles with 4 key ingredients. Number 1, we had to build a very broad coalition. So as I mentioned before, we were already 15 very diverse organizations. We had to expand it. We created a working group with the city of Chicago, with all city departments engaged in development, housing, planning, transit, transportation, and public health, the transit authorities, CMAP at the table, and then more than 40 plus community-based partners, environmentalists, public health partners, artists, developers, of course. So we had to create this big table, all of us pushing in the same direction, 2 compelling stories. So we had to change both the narrative and the narrators, and it cannot be planners talking about this. It had to be real people from Chicago, and it had to represent, the diversity. So we had to have people from all the different neighborhoods with great stories that you can see on our website about how important it is for them to live in a community that welcomes people and welcomes them and doesn't push them out. Incremental change. So I know we all want to change the world and the revolution and all that stuff. That's not realistic. So we had to start with small demonstrations at the micro level, just for people to see that you can have affordable housing development in a gentrifying area next to very fancy boutique places and all that stuff, and nobody dies. Actually, people like it. And you had to go to that one parking lot and work with the community and show them that you can build on top of a parking lot that, by the way, is half empty most of the time, and build a beautiful building, and suddenly, oh my God, nobody died again. And there's no traffic congestion. And the businesses are getting more people to shop because most people were not arriving in cars necessarily. So anyway, that incremental change, those demonstration projects, one by one, were really important. And then finally, for those of you who work for government, we hear you, we see you, we love you and respect you. Your leaders need to change the narrative. And our housing commissioner in Chicago refused to talk about, to explain why communities need to welcome affordable housing. She said, I'm past explaining to you why. What I want to talk to you is how this is going to happen, because it is going to happen. So if you are welcome to come to our table to shape it, but it is going to happen. It's not an option that some communities get to have affordable housing and some of them don't. So reframing the conversation in those terms, building for people, not for cars. She really helped with that narrative. We helped her too with examples, and the NIMBYs had to grapple with that. So as a result, some of the highlights of our work, when we started, there was one ETOD in Chicago in 2017. It was located in Woodlawn, still there. It's a beautiful affordable housing development next to the Cottage and 63rd stop of the Green Line. It's been built by POA, a great affordable housing developer, and it's housing in the first floor a great restaurant and institution in Chicago called Dailies. the oldest restaurant in Chicago. 6 years later, we have 40 plus ETOD sites across the city. And this is what the map looks like before we updated, because last week, the mayor announced another 26 grants to ETOD sites also across the city. Commissioner Navarra Housing put $800 million behind ETOD. He was very specific and clear that 12 of those had to be in the south and the west sides, which had seen no development, as you know, per my prior slide. The other 6 are all in gentrifying and wealthy areas. We adopted in 2021 an ETOD policy plan, the first one for Chicago, again, collaborative process. And out of that policy plan that we did in concert with the city came a recommendation for zoning reform. And last year, through all of this work, 36 aldermen voted yes to zoning reform in Chicago and passed a package of 12 major changes to our zoning code, including the end of mandatory parking near transit. So we don't have mandates anymore. We have maximums that people can build, not minimum parking. So what you can do now is, if you're building affordable housing, you don't have to provide any parking if you don't want to. And what we're trying to do here is for people to make the case as to why you need the parking, not as to why you have to reduce the parking, which was the prior model. So right now, near transit in Chicago, the maximum parking that is stipulated is 1 space for 2 units. It used to be 1:1, now it's 0.5 ratio. You can still go for more, but you have to be very clear as to why and justify that to the zoning folks. We also expanded the circle. So in the past, it was a 1/4 mile. Now a 1/2 mile around transit is eligible for incentives. So we more than doubled the amount of land eligible. And we also expanded it around along bus routes, because a lot of our communities do not have train stations. They do have frequent buses, and they're eligible too. So a lot of these changes and many more that I can tell you about if you want later on. And the city of Chicago has them all in their website, ETOD website of their site. And then finally, again, last year, as you all know, all those billions that you hear about that the federal government is making available for recovery, Chicago set aside $10 billion for ETOD sites to pay for pre-development and development. And we work with them. So the selection criteria prioritized Black and Latino-owned developers, majority Black and Latino communities, and a variety of types of development that are not your usual. So just to show you a few, here's some of the examples of what's in the pipeline in Chicago per the ETOD policy agenda that Elevated and the city have been working on. We have from affordable housing and small businesses together at the green line. We have spaces for artists in the blue line, gentrifying areas. We have senior housing on the red line in the south side. We have this very massive and necessary high rise for essential workers to find a place to live downtown next to the library. Who doesn't want to live there? Sign me up. We have a transformation of a school that was closed by Mayor Emanuel and now is being transformed into a business incubator next to the 51st stop of the Green Line. We have the Lucy Gonzalez Parsons Apartments, 100 units of affordable housing already built next to the Logan Square station, which is highly gentrified in Chicago. And we have another building coming up, by the way, across the street, another ETOD. And one that is one of my favorites is this organization, Bandwidth. It's an arts and culture center located in Garfield Park, and it's transforming businesses for kids to learn how to play instruments. And the headquarters are going to be transit oriented and have this pedestrian access. So I'll stop here because I want to make sure people have time to comment, and Traci has time to explain what she has learned too and wants to offer. But that's what we're doing. We love to share this with folks like you, and would love to partner with like-minded folks to make change in the region.
Thank you, Roberto. This is great. I don't know about all of you, but I feel like we've been on a journey here. You know, Sarah set this stage, we moved on to Sue, Roberto. It's just great to see how, you know, where there is a will, there is a way, and not just political will, but starting from the grassroots. And now move on to Traci.
And I'm actually not going to talk that long. I don't have a presentation. I just wanted to introduce myself, because also now that I've listened to the 3 presentations, we have a lot, like there was a lot of meat there. So I'm really interested to hear, one, what folks' questions are and like how to get into that. So I'll just say I'm Traci Sanders, the director of the Chicago market for Enterprise Community Partners. If you haven't heard of Enterprise, we are a national nonprofit that aims to address America's affordable housing crisis from every angle. We develop and deploy programs and support community organizations on the ground. We have policy researchers and advocates working on a nonpartisan basis at every level of government. We invest capital to build and preserve rental homes that people can afford. We've been around for about 40 years. We've built or preserved 873,000 homes, and we've invested $54 billion in hundreds of communities. And most importantly, everything the organization does is directly tied to our 3 main priorities, which is increasing the housing supply, advance racial equity, and build resilience and upward mobility. So that's Enterprise. A bit about myself, just so folks are understand what I bring to this conversation. I've actually been a planner for about 15 years now. I got my start in New York. Actually, I grew up in Chicago. I grew up on the south and the north sides because my parents were divorced. So, you know, having that perspective and graduating from Lincoln Park and going to the University of Chicago, it just brought a very interesting perspective about, you know, what it means, what does city building mean, and what, you know, I sort of innately understood that housing is important, that community is important, and that it has such, to Roberto's point, like such a deep impact on how you view yourself, how you view your family, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I took all of that. My first career was film and theater, which is why I moved to New York, but series of fortunate events, I became a planner and went to NYU Wagner. And for the last 15 years, I've been working in everything from land use as a technical planner to government, working for the New York City Council, to the Furman Center, Understanding Housing Policy. It's a housing policy think tank, and working for a design firm, WXY. Once I did all of that, I decided to bring all of that back to Chicago. My last position was the Illinois Housing Development Authority. And then I became the Chicago market director. So just wanted to give some background so people understand, like, I really feel like I have a lot of thoughts and ideas and perspective. One thing I did want to end on was, in all of that, I really feel like this conversation will probably, you know, I think what needs to be added to the conversation is just this real intentional, what is the role of government and what are our goals, right? So when I was listening about the, you know, equitable zoning, you know, when I'm thinking about that, it actually makes me think about some work I did in East Harlem on the East Harlem neighborhood plan. And, you know, when we talk about like being intentional, it's so hard to talk about zoning and to go into a community and talk about, you know, how zoning impacts their everyday lives. And I felt like that was really my first opportunity in creating a master plan, but also like sort of thinking through, how do you talk to communities about that specifically? We created like 6 focus areas and focus groups where we're talking about public safety, we're talking about schools, we're talking about transportation and all of this, right? And really getting to understand two things. I think one thing that we didn't say was you kind of have to go into that conversation with an idea, like testing ideas, because I feel like it's hard for folks to just, the people will think you could do the world, and it's like, nope. Yeah, here, let me give you some guardrails. Like, here are the guardrails, and here's the conversation. Like, here are the set of questions that we're trying to answer. And now I think in this day and age, what I always brought to my practice, because as I mentioned, I grew up in Chicago. I mentioned that intentionally because that is what I bring to my practice. I'm a Black woman, and thinking about how it impacts communities. I am specifically interested in how it impacts communities of color and women. Right. So like, even in thinking about that, where I feel like we've come a long way, especially in the last few years, is really understanding the importance of racial equity and like asking that next layer of questions, that it's not just about, how will it impact the built environment, but how does it impact the folks that live there? And then next, how does it impact the most vulnerable? And usually the most vulnerable do end up being folks with disabilities, people of color, all of that, because, we can talk about systemic inequity, right? But like, there was a point where I think we weren't asking those questions, and I feel good about like not being the only one in the room, asking those questions now. So I'll stop there. And if people, have thoughts or questions about anything that was brought up, that's it.
Thank you. What what a great way to sort of end the set presentations by kind of opening our horizons. And you talked about, I think all of you sort of said this, that it's not just about the built environment, but about people. And I just wanted to maybe ask the first question and then open it up to people. Will I don't know if Tricia will read the questions out, but to Sarah, just some of your thoughts in hearing these presentations, maybe about, as you embark on the comprehensive plan rewrite.
Well, absolutely. One of the things that's been discussed is the importance of reaching people who are not normally heard. And one of the interesting things the city is doing right now is our participatory budgeting process for some of our ARPA funds. And that is the kind of engagement that we are using in that process, which is really getting people from the communities that we are trying to reach involved in reaching them. So it's not just the same people from city government going out and trying to get everybody to talk to them, which doesn't frequently work, especially with communities that feel that they have not gotten the attention or the any real understanding of their needs from. So that's one of them. But, we have really historically followed the process that most, I shouldn't say that, in many of our individual planning processes, there was a fair amount of outreach, but it really wasn't focused on trying to make sure that we're reaching the people who are most vulnerable, which is an absolutely new focus. And one of the things that Sue talked about, which is the sort of, we have to acknowledge that our processes are full of, even things like when you look at our zoning standards, the standards that must be met by a development, does it respect the character of the community and things like that, that those code words, this is the kind of stuff that we have to just get rid of, because it's really a way of thinking that and approaching things that we're not looking to make change, which I think is harmful, because not only do we have to change a lot for our housing goals, we have to change a lot of things for all of our goals to make our communities livable. And not to burn up our planet in the next, few decades. What Roberto was talking about is absolutely true. We have to get people out of cars. We have to incentivize using public transportation, and the people we are most trying to engage are exactly the people who are already doing that, but we're not listening to them about how we could maybe improve things based on their experience.
Yeah, I'm just curious, Roberto and Sue, as you do that outreach to people, and Traci, and you were mentioning also Davenport, before the meeting, but really what has worked. I mean, Sue talked about going through trusted organizations, but are there other or even paying people? But what are some other things that you have found?
Oh, man.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Traci. No, you go ahead.
So I actually felt like it really, I would just say it does depend on the project, but you mentioned participatory budgeting. One thing, in my past practice, we had started to really utilize technology. And I know, I think the first thing people think is like, what about the digital divide, right? And I can explain that in a second. So like, first, I felt I love the use of certain platforms because it makes sort of the zoning or the question of like where a project or what the impact of a project is going to be more tangible, like you can touch and feel it. What we would do sometimes is go and take pictures of the place where something was going to happen, or put the description. So I can imagine for participatory budgeting, is there like, when we were doing it in New York, a lot of it was around schools and like whether we were going to do air conditioning in different places or whether in a park we were going to provide a new bathroom, right? It was such a good tool because people could just go in and vote and see exactly where the impact of city funds or city dollars was going to go. But to get past that digital issue, there's just been so many more tools that have been built to get to people, but also what we would do sometimes is like actually do pop-ups at different organizations, whether it was churches in the area or shelters or like anywhere and that people were, and even at train stations where we would have the iPad or whatever it was to be able to talk to people on the ground and really get sort of like, point in time information. So I'm just saying all that to say like technology is a good resource now, I think, especially when it comes to planning and comprehensive planning. But when I do think sometimes it's good to lean on organizations that have been like historically the voice, but I think it really depends on what is the question you're asking. Is it something that you're going to get more experiential information directly from the person who has the lived experience, or is it okay, to have this proxy? I think that's a judgment call that we have to make sometimes, right? So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, all of that. And I would just mention when we started our work in Elevated Chicago, we knew that community engagement was hard. We didn't know how hard, and we learned the hard way how hard it was. And when we started, we started around 7 CTA stations in Chicago that represent the issues that I mentioned before. Some of them were gentrifying quickly, some of them were depopulating quickly, some of them were majority Latino, some of them were majority African American. And we thought we wanted to hear from people what they wanted to see happen near transit. And people did have a ton of things they wanted, like, as I mentioned, homes or affordable, health clinics, grocery stores. But they also had a ton of stories about not the what, but the how we develop in Chicago, to the point that we had to stop the process and say, wait, we need to collect this on a separate track and make it as important. So what we did, we collected all of that and we produced a piece that is called Elevated Chicago's Community Engagement Principles and Recommendations, which includes also basic things that you would think a city would have and we don't, like rules during meetings. You know, the amount of people who feel intimidated at meetings or feel unheard. So we included those rules of engagement. We have them in all of our agendas. And I have to report, this is just in the new administration has adopted our rules of engagement as part of the transition committees meetings, understanding that those are very necessary rules for people to follow. I want to drop them in the chat. We are going to release the 2.0 version in a couple of weeks in Chicago because through COVID, we learned a lot too about how to engage. And basically is what Traci was talking about, that it's really not the what or even the who, it's about how you go about it, right? And sometimes it's very easy to say, oh my God, I'm going to neighborhood X. So I'm going to work with the neighborhood X community council, and they're going to be my representative and representing the community. And we said not to that. We are not asking organizations to represent the community because nobody can do that. Not even the aldermen can do that in a whole community. And I don't know about your neighborhood, but in my neighborhood, we have at least 5 different factions of people that don't like each other, right? So what we asked our community members is to establish community tables and to act as bridges and connectors to a diversity of voices. So we provide grants, they bring together the neighbors, they bring together the neighbors that get along, the ones that don't, they all bring in all that feedback and opinion into the community table, and they pass that along to us to guide our plans. And it's been working, not ideally, but better than the model where you select an appointed community organization that is supposed to be the ones representing everybody there. And that has not really worked that great.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've so much of what you're saying just fits so well with what we were doing and the experiences that we had. I'm excited about us really doing our analysis. We had 8 groups that were trying to do community outreach. And I think we found there's really 2 pieces to it. One is just getting people to hear our request to participate. And then the other one is having the conversations in such a way that you can get your question about something like zoning understood so that you can get substantive feedback. So how do you structure the conversation and what do people need to know ahead of time? And I think what we will be finding is that each of our 8 groups have something to teach us about how they were able to get people there to participate and then how that participation went. It didn't all go equally well in each of those areas for the different groups, but the varieties of things we tried, it was pretty amazing. I was on Haitian radio. Then we reached the Haitian community that way. We had people going out visiting churches. Like Traci said, we were going out to where people were. But then again, it comes back to that wasn't easy for our trusted messengers to do because they don't have organizations that have that infrastructure to go out and do this regularly. They do it sort of organically through the things they already have, and adding on to that is difficult. So there's just a ton to be learned here.
Great. Thank you. I want to make sure we hear, speaking of public engagement, the questions in the chat. I'm going to go to the question here. And I'm going to read here. Evanston is building a new school in the 5th Ward. What can we do to prevent the area from being gentrified from folks who want a new school with all the bells and whistles? Folks who already live in the 5th Ward need and deserve a neighborhood school where they're not bused and cannot lose their affordable housing. And for the benefit of Roberto and Traci, I don't know if you're aware, the 5th Ward is the traditionally Black community. Actually, it started, unfortunately with a history of steering into that community, but it's become a multi-generational, it's home. If any of you
Roberto, were you
want to
gonna
answer
go?
that, yeah, or
I mean, I have thoughts, like, I guess, it's interesting. And actually the school, it's not gonna be is it gonna be a private school? It's not gonna be like a neighborhood public school?
It's a public school.
Oh, it's gonna be a public school?
Yeah, it's going to be actually two schools within one school building almost, because the plan is to have a K-8 neighborhood school. And then there is another school that is a magnet school that has is the TWE program, which is the Spanish English, and they're planning on putting that school also K-8 in the same building.
Okay, so there's some fear that it's going to attract a new community okay, so here's.
Honestly, I think what we have to watch for is also this area is one that has been historically one of the most affordable places to buy anything. So, we are, one of the things the city did was acquired some properties that were going to be redeveloped by a developer that fell through. We acquired those and we haven't worked out how we're going to develop it, but it was specifically to keep it from being simply developed by the private market.
All right, you
so
kind of actually
that's a
answered
start.
part of what I was going to say. So part of, when it comes to preservation and especially preservation of affordability, I feel like that is the role of government, right? Like when you're thinking about housing and how to deploy housing tools across the city and you're thinking about like what the comprehensive plan is, the funny thing is part of me is like, but there's still a place-based approach, right? You still have to figure out, based on the built environment, because now, as you put up that map in the beginning with all the different districts and all of that, it seems daunting, but part of it is like, how do you blow all that up and then sort of redraw it and say, like, here's what can happen. But when you're doing that, understanding the sort of localized economics of a place is really important. And if you're thinking about, preservation, one of, I'll use like Woodlawn in Chicago as an example, right? Like, right now home prices, especially for new single family homes, are like beyond expensive, beyond what, folks who have historically lived in the neighborhood can afford. There was already a missed opportunity, right? So the opportunity of buying land or holding on to land as the city to sort of think through what could happen, what needs to be built here in order to make sure that folks that have historically lived in the community can benefit from any new investment that's coming, that I felt like in Woodlawn, we kind of missed that boat, but if you're looking at like, oh, we know something is coming, like, I do think that is the role of government, is to think through what is both the local strategy, whether that be some kind of preservation overlay, whether that be some tool like a community land trust or land bank or something, right? Where you're guiding what development is going to happen there. It needs to be a toolkit. It needs to be a variety of strategies, right? But that has to be based on, what's kind of happening there, what's the local economics, at what levels are you trying to preserve affordability, right? And like, while not, what's the word? Disincentivizing it, but like, you still want, I think everyone wants their area to grow, right? But it's just, we want to be able to stay and reap the benefits. So how do we do that? And I think, buying that property is definitely like a first step, but it will take going back and seeing what's the toolkit that we need in order to preserve affordability.
Mm-hmm. We're also focusing some of our ARPA money on, we're calling it the one-stop shop for retrofitting existing homes for energy efficiency and climate resilience. And that is focused specifically on that part of Evanston. It's Census Tract 8092. It was also one of our NSP census tracts. We had 2 of those, and we did a significant amount of acquisition and rehab of foreclosed properties to try to return them to productive use and maintain affordability. But so what we're working is to try to help existing homeowners and property owners figure out how we can use other resources to improve their homes and make it possible for them to have better living conditions, first of all, but also because we have those health inequities that we were talking about, which is a major issue there, but also to increase the value of their investment and maintain them in their neighborhood. We're talking about things like how to educate people about how not to respond to people who are suddenly very interested in buying your property, know what you're doing, you know, things like that too, which we also have to consider because there can be, people can make it sound really sweet that they're going to give you a great job, a great deal on buying your house, and they're actually really trying to really, you know, get control of it, and will make something much more, make more money on it. One of the interesting things, though, is our zoning, because it is so impossible, makes it impossible for anybody to build anything without coming for variances. So we have a certain amount of control from that standpoint, from a not necessarily a positive how to develop what you want, but being able to at least know what's going on and be able to get certain projects out in front of the public so they can be aware of it and have say on whether they want it in their community or not. We've had interesting pushback actually for a 44 unit all affordable development, which has now been downsized to a 33. So we also have that problem. You know, sometimes the people who are living in the community already fear any kind of development, and I can understand that. So you're right, it's a dynamic situation, and you have to respond to individual issues as they come up and really work with the people living there. So
Yeah, right.
Thank you. I wish we were getting down to the last minute here at 8:30. I feel like we need a part 2. We had additional questions here about insights on working with developers and good examples of progressive zoning reform. I don't think we have much time for that, but I did want to give each of you, the speakers, 30 seconds to, if you want to add any closing thoughts. CABG, we're all still here, and we're all still going to be working on this, and we're all going to be watching and participating with the city as you unfold the comprehensive plan process. But love to hear, maybe starting backwards, starting with Traci, Roberto, Sue, and Sarah.
Oh, I
Last
mean, my
thoughts.
I was gonna say, this is a great conversation. I mean, and you're right, there's so many good questions in the chat. I will say, as far as my experience with developers, I'm actually working on an initiative right now called Equitable Path Forward, where I'm working with BIPOC led firms. And it's probably one of our only initiatives where we work with for-profit developers. I would say it's been really interesting and really honestly like a good experience for me personally. Lots of these developers are getting started and are doing this because it's their, what's the word? It's basically kind of their life's work. They want to go back to their community and, grow and support the growth of their communities that they grew up in. So it's been, really cool and really just this sort of, it's becoming a labor of love for me. But it's one of the, I would say like it runs the gamut, the dealing with different kinds of developers, but that's a particular initiative that is really special in the work that I do right now. So I'll close with that.
So for me, really quick, again, thanks for caring about the stuff. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's great to see how many residents in Evanston want to change things in your town. And to me, the most important part of what I do is realizing the power of stretching yourself and going into communities, groups, areas of expertise that are completely strange to you and you do not quite fit and you feel uncomfortable for a minute, and then realizing that once you pass through that discomfort, a lot of people in areas that you wouldn't think of have the same goals that you have, they just speak a different language, right? So for us, opening up our table to transportation experts, to developers, to organizers, artists, all of them pushing the same direction was very critical. And there's a ton of those unusual suspects right out there. I know it's great to be with friends that agree with you and say, you know, similar things and you don't get mad and do understand them. But some of the most productive stuff for us, for me, has been being challenged by others that have kind of said, you know, yes, but you're going about this the wrong way, and being educated by others and joining forces again with chambers of commerce and with organizers and with public health experts and folks who, you know, 6 years ago didn't know they would be interested at all in housing.
Oh, Sue?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I want to reiterate the thanks to everybody for being here. One thing I'm really encouraged about is just how many people are interested in talking about affordable housing and gentrification and planning and all of that stuff. So I'm really encouraged by that. I think we're reaching a critical sort of threshold in Evanston. Whereas we're moving towards both the comprehensive planning and the zoning reform. We're also at a point now where we're not just talking about affordable housing, but there's more and more opportunity. And I think that is a very precarious point that we're at, because a lot of times the true opposition doesn't come out until there's actually a site, a location for something. And so I think the conversations we're having are really good because they're going to be necessary. We're starting to look at building stuff, and that's where the rubber's really going to hit the road in terms of what people's beliefs are about whether they can accept affordable housing, whether they will actually embrace it. So more of these conversations, the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
I think a really important thing that was said earlier is not just, are we going to do it? Is not to approach it from that way. It's the, how are we going to do this? Because I think that it's the, we have to really talk in terms of, Sue is right. We get a great deal of, you will get a great portion of our population that will say, yes, affordable housing is important and all that, you know, but when it gets site specific is when it really gets difficult. But I think we really do need to frame it as a not if we do this, but how we do this, and make also try to find examples of other places where this is really working. And in fact, even in our own community, sometimes we don't look at where we have successfully put affordable housing, and you know, we tend to be afraid of change. And I think that that's just something that a lot of the conversations, Roberto's right too, they're not going to be easy. And if they're all easy, then you know you're not getting all the people involved who you need to be getting involved from any perspective. So it's got to be a community-wide agreement that this is not are we going to do this, but how we're going to do this. So that's a big challenge, and we'll be trying to engage all of you in the future community, a comprehensive planning process, and to have you bring in more and more people from that we haven't already reached, help us with that. Thank you. And I really appreciate all of you being here, and I really appreciate the robust discussion and great ideas.
Fantastic. What a great way to end. Thank you. Yes, it's not about do we do this, but how. So thank you all. This has been recorded. Thank you, Allie, and we'll make this available somehow. Allie, could you tell us how you'll put it on this? You'll send an email to everybody.
Yes, I will somehow transfer it from the cloud to YouTube, CABG's YouTube, and we'll send it out. And then if the presenters are willing to share their slides, that would be great, and we can put together a little info packet afterwards.
Great. Well, good night. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much for coming.